There is a building in Washington, D.C. that does not appear on any public directory. No sign outside. No logo on the door. No listing in any federal organizational chart that any civilian can access. The people who work inside it do not tell their families what they do. Not because they were told not to, but because after 6 months on the job, they genuinely cannot explain it in any language that a normal person would understand without becoming afraid. What they do is not spying. It is not hacking. It is not assassination or surveillance or any of the things that come to mind when people imagine what intelligence agencies do. What they do is quieter, more precise, more invasive. They study the human mind not to understand it, but to break it, rebuild it, and aim it like a weapon at a target that could be an individual, a population, a government, or an entire belief system. And then pull the trigger without ever firing a single shot. This is the world of government psychological warfare, known inside the intelligence community as PSYOP psychological operations. This is your life at every level inside a government psychological warfare unit. And by the time this video ends, you will never look at what you believe, or why you believe it, the same way again. Every level requires you to give something up. At the bottom, you give up your innocence. At the top, you give up something you cannot name. But you feel its absence every single day. You do not start in the field. Nobody starts in the field. You start in a basement. No windows. Fluorescent lighting that hums at a frequency just below conscious awareness. A security clearance that took 14 months, 6 polygraph sessions, and the most invasive background investigation of your life to obtain. You are a Level 1 analyst. In the US military, your designation is 37F Psychological Operations Specialist. Your unit falls under the United States Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command, headquartered at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, still called Fort Bragg by everyone who works there, because the people inside this world have been there long enough that a name change feels like exactly the kind of surface-level gesture they spend their professional lives designing for other people. The title on your access badge says something like Strategic Communications Research Associate. Bland enough that anyone who asks about your job at a dinner party immediately changes the subject. That is exactly what you need. Your first week is orientation. The people who brief you are calm, professional. They speak in the measured language of academics presenting research findings, not government officials describing activities that would generate significant public controversy if they appeared on the front page of the Washington Post, which they have appeared on multiple times, over multiple decades. The program continues regardless. On day 3, a senior analyst 12 years in, the kind of person whose face carries the specific expression of someone who has processed more complexity than most nervous systems are designed for, sits across the conference table and explains the foundational philosophy in terms you will spend the rest of your career returning to. She says, "We are not in the business of creating beliefs from nothing. Nobody is. What we do is understand the beliefs that already exist, the fears, the hopes, the grievances, the identities, and learn how to work with them. How to activate the ones that serve our objectives. How to suppress the ones that don't. How to create the conditions under which the beliefs we need will grow naturally, in ways that the people holding them experience as entirely their own." She pauses. The goal is never to feel like influence. The goal is to feel like reality. You write that down. Your first 6 months are spent reading everything. Your unit maintains access to over 400 media sources across 60 countries. Newspapers in Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, Farsi, television broadcasts, radio intercepts, social media data streams, academic journals across psychology, sociology, political science, behavioral economics, internal government documents from foreign states obtained through channels you not yet cleared to know about, fringe online forums where specific varieties of belief are expressed without the social filtering that mainstream platforms impose. Your job is to identify patterns. Not in what people say, in what people believe. In the architecture underneath their beliefs. The load-bearing walls that, if correctly identified and correctly targeted, determine whether the entire structure stands or falls. Your unit uses a framework built from multiple academic sources. Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundations theory from NYU, which identifies 6 fundamental moral intuitions that vary in emphasis across political and cultural communities. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's cognitive bias research documented in Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which maps the systematic, predictable errors in human reasoning that occur at the level of mental architecture rather than individual choice. George Gerbner's cultivation theory from the Annenberg School for Communication, which describes how sustained exposure to consistent media narratives shapes a population's fundamental assumptions about social reality. You combine these into what your unit calls a belief architecture assessment, a document that maps, for a target population, the dominant cognitive biases that shape how they process new information, the moral foundations that carry the most emotional weight, the historical grievances that remain unresolved and therefore emotionally raw, the trusted authorities they defer to, the distrusted authorities that trigger automatic rejection, the narrative templates they find most psychologically satisfying. You are mapping minds from the outside. At the end of your first 6 months, your first assessment is 47 pages. It covers a mid-sized population in a country that will not be named here. It identifies 12 specific cognitive vulnerabilities and recommends 4 influence vectors that your analysis suggests will produce measurable changes in the target population's political attitudes within 90 to 120 days. You receive a commendation from your section chief. You go home and sit in your kitchen for a long time without turning the lights on. Not because you feel guilty. Because you are beginning to understand, at a level that feels physical rather than intellectual, that everything you just did to that population could be done to any population, including yours, including you. 18 months in, 3 of your assessments have been used in active operations. You were not told the details. You were told your analysis contributed to outcomes evaluated as successful at a classification level above your current access. You have been promoted. Level 2, the targeting specialist, is where the work stops being abstract. At level 1, you studied populations, aggregates, statistical communities. At level 2, you narrow the lens to individuals. The technical term is influence target selection. The data infrastructure it relies on is one of the most invasive aggregations of personal information ever assembled. Your unit accesses behavioral analytics platforms that pull from sources whose full scope, if publicly known, would generate the kind of congressional hearing that ends careers. Social media data, not just public posts, but engagement patterns underneath them. What a person likes but does not share. What they stop scrolling at for more than 3 seconds. What they type and then delete. The emotional vocabulary they use in private messages versus public posts. The times of day when they are most emotionally vulnerable. Consumer purchasing data, bought legally through data brokers who maintain commercial relationships with major retail chains. What a person buys reveals their health anxieties, financial situation, religious practices, relationship status, and fears about the future, things they have never consciously articulated to another human being. Location data harvested from smartphone applications where a person seeks medical treatment, where they worship, where they spend time late at night, and crucially, who they spend time near. Because location data from multiple phones in the same physical space, aggregated over time, maps a person's real social network with a precision that no self-reported survey could match. This data is not obtained illegally. It is purchased through commercial data brokers including Veriset and Safegraph, both extensively reported on by the Wall Street Journal from companies that collect it through terms of service agreements that billions of people click through without reading. Combined with psychological profiling frameworks, the Big Five personality model developed at UC Berkeley, Haight's moral foundations theory, Kahneman's cognitive bias taxonomy, the data produces a psychological portrait of an individual that is more accurate than anything their closest family members could construct. Your unit can identify, from this data alone, with statistical accuracy validated against real operational outcomes, what a specific individual is most afraid of, what they most deeply want to believe about themselves and the world, which narratives they are neurologically predisposed to find compelling, which messengers, what voice, what face, what institutional authority they will extend instinctive trust to, which emotional trigger, delivered at which moment, through which platform, will produce the specific behavioral change the operation requires. You are not reading minds. You are doing something more reliable than reading minds. You are reading the data that minds leave behind the digital exhaust of a billion daily decisions and running it through frameworks that are, in their predictive accuracy, more reliable than the individuals themselves would be if you simply asked them what they believe. Because people do not always know what they believe. But the data does. At level 2, you stop thinking of what you do as research. You start thinking of it as engineering. The ethical weight of that arrives differently for different people. Some analysts develop what unit psychologists call moral compartmentalization, a functional separation between the technical work and its human consequences. They go home, watch television, go to the gym. The work stays at the office. Others cannot maintain the separation. They start running targeting analyses on the people they love. Automatically. Involuntarily. They identify the cognitive vulnerabilities of their partner, their parents, their friends. They see the belief architectures of everyone they talk to. The unit prefers the first type. The second type does not stay at level 2 long. 3 years in. You have been read into programs that do not appear in any budget documents submitted to Congress under their actual names. You have signed non-disclosure agreements with no expiration date and penalties described by a government attorney as significant in the specific, careful tone of someone who means it precisely and prefers not to elaborate. You are a Level 3 operations designer. This is where the architecture gets built. Levels 1 and 2 were preparation. Level 1 mapped the terrain. Level 2 identified the targets. Level 3 designs the campaign, the coordinated, sequenced, psychologically calibrated series of interventions that will move a target population from their current belief state to the belief state the operation requires. An influence operation, in the United States Army PSYOP Field Manual FM 3-53, is formally defined as a coordinated set of activities designed to affect the perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors of a target audience in support of a commander's objectives. Clean. Purposive. Stripped of moral weight. Here is how an operation is designed at Level 3. Step 1. The objective. Not vague. Specific, measurable, behaviorally defined, with a timeline. Not reduce support for X but reduce active participation in X by 30 among a specific demographic in a specific geographic area within 120 days. The specificity is not formalism. It is the difference between an operation that can be evaluated and adjusted and one that simply continues indefinitely, consuming resources and producing outcomes nobody can measure. Step 2. The narrative architecture. What story does the target population need to believe to produce the desired behavioral change? This is the part most people find counterintuitive. Because the answer is almost never a lie. The most effective influence operations in the documented history of PSYOP are built on true information. Real facts. Real events. Real statements made by real people selected, sequenced, and framed to produce a specific emotional and cognitive response. A lie can be disproved. A carefully selected truth cannot. A fact, framed correctly, presented through the right channel, by the right messenger, produces a reaction that is indistinguishable from genuine, autonomous belief because in a meaningful sense it is genuine belief. The person who holds it arrived at it through their own reasoning. They just reasoned from the inputs you provided. The academic framework underlying this is narrative transportation theory research by Melanie Green and Timothy Brock at Ohio State University, establishing that individuals engaged with a compelling story suspend their normal critical evaluation and update their beliefs in the direction the narrative implies. Your unit calls it immersive framing. The mechanism is identical. Step 3. The delivery infrastructure. Who delivers the narrative matters as much as the narrative itself. Your unit maintains relationships through structures of varying directness and deniability with what the doctrine calls influence nodes. People, institutions, and platforms capable of delivering specific messages to specific audiences with specific levels of credibility. Some relationships are direct. A media organization historically cooperative with intelligence community story placement requests. An academic researcher whose work your unit quietly funded through a foundation intermediary, who therefore produces research supporting the operational narrative without knowing the research agenda was shaped by people who needed specific findings. A think tank employing former intelligence community officials whose policy recommendations, not coincidentally, align with the strategic objectives of operations those officials use to design. Some relationships are indirect. Your unit identifies an existing community leader, journalist, or social media personality whose platform and credibility make them a useful delivery vehicle. The unit does not contact them, does not offer money or direction. Instead, the unit creates the conditions under which they will naturally encounter the information the operation needs them to amplify and trusts that their genuine beliefs and existing audience will do the rest. This is what the doctrine calls an unwitting asset. A real person. With real beliefs. With real credibility earned through years of genuine work. Who is, from the operations perspective, a delivery mechanism for a narrative they did not originate and would not recognize as engineered. The operation works precisely because they are real. Because their conviction is authentic. Because no investigative journalist or congressional committee can find a paper trail between your unit and their platform. Because there is no paper trail. There is only a carefully constructed information environment that made it inevitable they would find the information themselves and decide, entirely of their own autonomous free will, to share it. At level 3, for the first time in your career, you begin having difficulty sleeping. Not because you feel guilty, because you are good enough at this work to recognize the techniques when you encounter them outside the office. And you are encountering them everywhere. 4.5 years in. First overseas deployment. The paperwork describes it as a temporary duty assignment supporting a strategic communications initiative in a partner nation context. The cover is thin. The people with clearance to see through it have, in the institutional culture of this world, a deeply ingrained understanding that the appropriate response is to continue looking in a different direction. You are operating in a country experiencing significant political instability. Two competing power structures, one allied with U.S. strategic interests, one aligned with interests the U.S. government considers adversarial fighting for legitimacy. Not primarily through military force. Primarily through information. Through the contest over which version of reality the population will accept as true. Your unit has been tasked with supporting one side of that contest. Your official presence is covered by an NGO affiliation. A civil society organization registered, staffed by genuine believers in its stated mission that your unit has developed a relationship with through a funding mechanism sufficiently indirect that the organization's leadership does not know the origin of a portion of their operating budget. This is documented history, not speculation. The Church Committee hearings of 1975, the most comprehensive congressional investigation into U.S. intelligence activities ever conducted, documented in extensive detail the CIA's Cold War practice of funding civil society organizations, student groups, labor unions, academic institutions, and media outlets across dozens of countries as influence vehicles. Alan Weinstein, one of the founders of the National Endowment for Democracy, described it in a 1991 Washington Post interview as doing openly what the CIA used to do covertly. Your program is the evolved, data-driven, digitally sophisticated descendant of those structures. In the field, you manage relationships with 3 local journalists who know you as an NGO researcher. The information you provide them is real, accurate, and selected with surgical precision for the ways it supports the operational narrative. You provide logistical support to a community organizer whose movement is genuine, her beliefs are real, her passion is real, her courage in the face of personal risk is real. She has no idea that the resources flowing to her organization originate in a program funded by a foreign government. You also manage a social media amplification network, a constellation of accounts operated, through multiple contractor intermediaries, by your unit. Some accounts are fabricated. Most are real people, community members with modest existing audiences who have agreed to share specific content in exchange for modest compensation, without understanding that the content was selected and in some cases created by an intelligence operation. In the field, you also encounter something that the design room does not prepare you for. Reality. The difference between designing an influence operation in a secure facility and coordinating one in an actual country is the difference between designing a building on a computer and trying to build it in an earthquake. Real people do not behave according to their psychological profiles with perfect consistency. Real events occur that the operational design did not anticipate. Real journalists ask questions that were not supposed to be asked. And the people living in this country, the actual human beings in the target population, are experiencing real suffering. Poverty. Violence. Institutionnelle corruption. The accumulated weight of historical injustice. And the relationship between their suffering and your operation is not clean, not simple, and not something the operational design document addresses in any way you find adequate. At level 4, the word blowback stops being an abstract operational concept. Blowback is the intelligence community term for unintended consequences, the ways in which the effects of what you do escape the boundaries of the target context. Narratives engineered for one environment migrate, mutate, reappear elsewhere. Psychological techniques refined for use against foreign populations get documented by researchers, published in academic journals, and adopted by domestic political actors, commercial advertising firms, and online communities with no connection to government. The tool leaves the toolbox. You cannot control who picks it up. 7 years in. You run a program now. Not an operation. A program, the persistent infrastructure that makes operations possible. The ongoing relationships, the maintained assets, the sustained digital infrastructure, the institutional knowledge that exists inside the heads of people you have trained and deployed and in some cases watched break under the pressure of what this work requires. At level 5 you have budget authority. Significant budget authority. You manage programs spanning multiple countries simultaneously. Your contractor network viewed from the outside looks like an unconnected constellation of research firms, communications consultancies, and civil society organizations spread across 3 continents. Viewed from the inside, it is a coherent, integrated influence infrastructure of considerable sophistication. You attend interagency meetings. Rooms containing people from the National Security Council, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, representatives from Allied Services British GCHQ, whose psychological operations capabilities reflect decades of experience in Northern Ireland and the Cold War. Israeli Unit 8200, widely assessed as operating one of the most technically sophisticated information operations programs in the world. French DGSE, whose methods in Francophone Africa have been the subject of extensive investigative reporting by Le Monde and Mediapart, and whose approach in certain operational environments is considered, in the careful language of Allied intelligence assessments, aggressive. In these rooms, the language is precise, technical, stripped of emotional weight. You discuss the information environment of a target country the way an engineer discusses load-bearing structures. You discuss belief systems, the deepest convictions of entire populations about who they are and what history means and what God demands as variables in strategic equations. You discuss specific individuals, journalists, politicians, community leaders in terms of their utility to operational objectives, their leverage, their vulnerabilities, their susceptibility to specific approaches. You are very good at this. At level 5, the unit assigns you a dedicated psychologist. His name is Dr. Marcus Webb, PhD from Stanford. 8 years at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center before moving into the intelligence community. He is a thoughtful, honest man who has never pretended that the sessions serve only your interests. He is there to ensure you remain operationally functional. The sessions exist at the intersection of genuine therapeutic support and institutional risk management. In your sessions with Dr. Webb, the word that comes up most frequently not from him, from you is weight. Not guilt. Not shame. Not regret in the specific sense those words imply. Weight. The accumulated, compounding, unrelenting weight of 7 years of decisions made in moral grey zones. None catastrophic individually. All defensible within the operational and legal frameworks in which they were made. All of them resting on a foundation of genuine belief that the work matters, that the adversaries are real, that the consequences of not doing this would be worse than the consequences of doing it. All of them adding, increment by increment, to a structure you carry in a part of yourself that does not have a name in any professional vocabulary you have encountered. Psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, who developed the concept of moral injury to describe the psychological damage experienced by Vietnam veterans who participated in actions that violated their own moral code, described it as the betrayal of what is right by someone who holds power. Researchers at Boston University and the VA's National Center for PTSD have expanded the framework to describe the moral injury experienced by anyone who, over a sustained period, operates in a context requiring the systematic violation of their own ethical convictions. Dr. Webb does not use the term moral injury with you. He uses cognitive load accumulation. You suspect this is because moral injury implies something wrong was done, and cognitive load accumulation does not. There is a level above level 5 that is never described in any unclassified document. No official title. No office in any building on a government directory. The people who occupy it do not, in most cases, hold direct government employment. They operate through think tanks, private consulting firms, academic institutions with deep historical ties to the intelligence community, and private foundations whose funding sources would require, according to one investigative journalist who spent 4 years attempting to trace them, the forensic capabilities of a mid-sized federal agency to fully document. They are the architects. They do not design operations. They do not manage programs. They build the environment, the information ecosystem itself, the media landscape, the algorithmic infrastructure of the platforms through which billions of people encounter the world, the academic research agenda, which questions about human behavior get funded, which frameworks get legitimized, which findings get published and which are classified or simply defunded into irrelevance. The policy frameworks within which all lower levels operate. The architect does not tell a specific person what to believe. The architect builds the water. And fish do not know they are in water. The documented history of this level is fragmentary because the people who conduct it are the people with the greatest resources and motivation to prevent documentation. What exists in the public record is a set of fragments. The Church Committee in 1975 documented Operation Mockingbird, the CIA's sustained program of relationships with major American media organizations, editors, and journalists that shaped domestic news coverage for decades. Relationships with newspapers, wire services, television networks, and individual journalists whose work shaped the domestic information environment for an entire generation. The Senate Intelligence Committee's bipartisan report on Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election documented in specific detail how a state actor used social media algorithms, targeted digital advertising, the organic amplification tendencies of platform recommendation systems, and coordinated networks of authentic and inauthentic accounts to identify, exacerbate, and amplify pre-existing divisions in American society. What that Senate report documented a sophisticated, data-driven, algorithmically assisted influence operation targeting the domestic information environment of the United States is structurally identical to what your unit has been doing in other countries for decades. The difference is the flag on the operation. At the architect level, you do not think in terms of operations or programs or even decades. You think in terms of generations. Because the most durable influence, the kind that reshapes the fundamental assumptions of a society so completely that the people inside experience those assumptions as natural and entirely their own, does not happen in 120-day operational cycles. It happens over the time it takes for children to grow up inside an information environment that was shaped, before they were born, by people with specific strategic objectives. The ideas they find obvious. The political possibilities they can and cannot imagine. The authorities they instinctively trust and the communities they experience as threatening. All of it is the output of an information ecosystem. And information ecosystems respond to sustained, well-resourced, strategically directed intervention. At the architect level, you are the intervention. Here is what every level of this world eventually forces you to confront. The techniques work. The academic research underlying these operations was not invented by intelligence agencies. It was developed by universities, published in peer-reviewed journals, taught in graduate programs and business schools around the world. It describes how human minds actually function, the specific, predictable, reproducible ways in which human beings are not the rational, self-determining agents that democratic theory requires them to be. And once you know that, once you have spent years inside a system that applies that knowledge at scale, you cannot unknow it. You cannot watch the news without seeing the narrative architecture. You cannot scroll through social media without identifying the amplification patterns. You cannot listen to a politician, a journalist, a researcher, a person you love without some part of your mind quietly, automatically, involuntarily running the targeting analysis. What cognitive vulnerability is this message exploiting? What pre-existing belief is it activating? Who benefits from the behavioral change this emotional state will produce? And the question underneath all of those questions, the one that no operational success, no interagency meeting, no session with Dr. Webb has ever fully answered. If human belief is this malleable, if the convictions that feel most certain and most authentically yours are this susceptible to the kind of engineering you have spent your career performing, then what do you actually believe? And how would you know the difference? Somewhere right now. In a basement facility with no windows, in a building that does not appear on any public directory, there is a 26-year-old analyst sitting in front of a secure terminal. She has a graduate degree from a good university. She has a genuine intellectual passion for the psychology of belief. She was recruited because she is intelligent, disciplined, psychologically resilient, and capable of holding moral complexity without paralysis. She has been in the job for 4 months. She believes in what she is doing. She is building a belief architecture assessment. The target population is 2.3 million people in a country she has never visited. She is finding the cracks in their belief system with a precision and a speed that would have been impossible 10 years ago. She is very good at it. And in the psychological profile she is building, buried in the analytical framework of cognitive vulnerabilities and influence vectors, there are real human beings. People who love their children and fear for their futures. People who have suffered injustices that are real and deserve to be addressed. People whose beliefs, whose fears, whose most fundamental convictions about who they are about to become variables in an equation they will never know exists. The question is not whether this is happening. The only question, the one that the entire institutional architecture of this world is designed, with considerable sophistication, to prevent you from sitting still long enough to ask, is whether knowing changes anything, or whether the architecture is strong enough that even the people who built it cannot see outside it. Because if knowing makes no difference, the architects won a long time ago. If you made it to this moment, you already know what this channel is. We do not do comfortable. We do not do surface level. Next, video your life as every rank in an underground crime syndicate. From street-level runner to the rank that controls sitting judges, serving police chiefs, and elected officials and answers to no one. If that is something you need to understand, you already know what to do.